Hello, I'm Satnik Baltasaryan. I'm representing for Equal Rights NGO. I'm serving currently as the president of the organization. Today we're going to talk about the field of civil society organizations in Armenia and the situation that the civil society organizations are facing after the war and also after the COVID pandemic. To start, I would like to talk about the pre-revolution situation and also the expectations of the NGOs. So basically, the 2018 Velvet Revolution served as a U-turn in Armenian politics, and it seemed to be the cornerstone of the democracy building in Armenia. 20 years of consistent struggle of the civil society organizations to push for a minimum change in the democracy building in Armenia and also to push for democratic narratives in the public, to educate the public with skills and knowledge to be efficient as citizens of Armenia finally was crowned with success. And it is really worth mentioning that the civil society organization played a key role in the 20-year-long effort that led to the revolution in Armenia. After the revolution, when the elections took place and when the government was formed, a lot of civic activists and civil society representatives took positions in the government as well as in the parliament and other state institutions of Armenia. And this created a truly new situation both for the civil society organizations and for the new government as well. First of all, the NGOs and the civil society organizations faced the challenge of reshaping their own role as a civil society, because before that they were serving mainly as an informal opposition to the authorities, and currently they got an opportunity to act as collaborators and also as partners for the democratic reforms of the country. For the civil society organizations, this was very new, and also they needed time to reshape their actions. From the perspective of the government and the new authorities, the people who were serving as officials also needed time to build their own capacity to act as bureaucrats. And because of the fact that many civil society representatives were involved in the authorities, there was kind of a silent agreement between the civil society organizations not to criticize harshly from the very beginning and to give time to the government and the parliament to take the initiative for the democratic reforms in Armenia. Because of this, basically, we can assess it now as a mistake because later on it turned to a confrontation between the civil society organizations and the authorities. As due to the vibrant nature of the civil society, many priorities have been changed and many issues and challenges were created that were not mentioned by the authorities. By saying this, I mean that many of the civil society organizations ignored the new representatives of the civil society, backing their argument with the fact that they themselves present the civil society and they had a long way and expertise in the civil society itself. So basically, to conclude this part, the civil society organizations and the new officials in the parliament and the government needed to adapt themselves to the new situation, but the main issue came from the fact that the new officials weren't prepared enough and did not take into consideration the fact that the new civil society should be highly appreciated and considered and also involved in the policy-making process. And this needed the development of new channels and means of cooperation and communication that were not created efficiently or were not created at all. If we come to the post-revolutionary situation, we can assess that there was a setback from the democratic processes, even if we can say that the current authorities were democratically elected and they enjoyed 70+% of support of the population in the beginning of their governance. However, if we look at the policies adopted by them, we see that they do not necessarily comply with the democratic values or prepare grounds for the democratic reform. And this was very vivid right after the revolution, and the biggest criticism towards the current authorities by the civil society organizations and many NGOs these days relates to the transitional justice reform, lack of education reform, absence of assessment of the past, bad cadre policies, and also non-strategic approach to the certain fields they were responsible for. So, and this really became obvious, especially after the COVID pandemic and 44-day war. It really broke the last chain of the trust towards the governance, and it showed the unpreparedness and also inability of the current authorities to handle adequately the crisis situations. On the positive side, it's worth mentioning that the civil society organizations, firstly, after the revolution, they received the chance to publicize their own efforts and to publicize it through the main media channels, including the TVs, which was not the case before the revolution. So the public TVs were marginalizing mainly the civil society representatives, and only after the revolution the NGOs got a chance to be present at the mainstream media. Talking about the post-revolutionary situation, it is important to talk about the legislative framework for CSOs and NGOs, and it is worth to talk about the law on NGOs and other legislation that relates to the field. The issue here is that there is a law on NGOs, and it was adopted in 2016, and after that all the amendments, and especially the last amendments, were not creating better background and working opportunities for the NGOs. During the COVID pandemic, there was a new legislative act that was introduced to the civil society organizations and NGOs, which was basically saying that except for the taxing report, the NGOs have to present content-related report to the government, which is somehow inappropriate measure, because the government was telling that this law was introduced to create opportunities for the NGOs to be more public and to publicize their efforts. But when we look deeper at the amendment, we see that this makes the NGOs more vulnerable and more controllable, because even before that, if there was a suspicious act by the NGOs, the police could take the lead and basically to investigate what is going on. And this is inadequate, and it's also a disproportionate measure by the government. So when we are thinking that this government somehow supports the NGOs, the new amendment can become a tool against the NGOs if the government changes or even nowadays. So this is why we should say that there is not enough legislative framework, and it is made worse after the revolution and by the post-revolutionary government. And also, like, when we look at the post-revolutionary situation, another very important topic to talk about the field is the hate speech and defamation campaigns against the NGOs. I mean, Outside the National Assembly and outside the government, currently where the political elite faces a very resourceful and nationalist conservative opposition, and we can say that the country itself is facing a conservative backlash. Interestingly, the conservative backlash is backed by the former authorities mainly, who basically strengthen their argument and manipulate because of the fact that they own 70+% of the media of Armenia. And we see a situation that by using their outlets and the TVs, they can manipulate with the main taboo topics and make the NGOs as the main target of the hate speech in Armenia. So another interesting fact is that the conservatives and the nationalists also realized the power of the NGOs, and they created so-called a new phenomenon, which can be called as a new anti-civil society NGO sector, which formed in very large numbers and quickly became very active and also very, very visible. So they started using their own NGOs as effective tools for shaping new public narratives and also shaping new public debate. The new organization started openly attacking the already existing ones, especially the NGOs working in the fields of human rights and in the fields of democratization. So they manipulated the discussion on serious laws and policies, as for example the fight against domestic violence, the education reform, the anti-discrimination policies, etc., etc. So the worst thing that happened is that currently the online hate speech campaign has turned to offline one, and many cases have emerged when the civil society organizations, NGOs and media have been targeted physically. So this was not a mainstream case, and this happened also before the revolution, but this became more regular after the revolution and especially after the war. So the main dimensions and the main arguments used by the conservatives and nationalist groups, who can somehow be called as anti-revolutionaries, were 4 points. The first point was the taboo topic, the LGBT community and anything related to that. The second one was the main argument which was defending the Christian values as fundamental of Armenian society. The third dimension they started manipulating with, they created a new label for the human rights activists mainly, which can be called as Soros people. And interestingly, this did not have much to do with Open Society foundations, and we can say that by calling Soros people, there was a label given to any human rights defender and activist that was working towards the democratization of the country. And it doesn't have anything to do with the funding by the Open Society foundations, because many of these human rights activists have never received any funding from the foundation. And also it is worth mentioning that today manipulate with Soros people label. They themselves had certain links with the Open Society foundations before that they somehow forgot. When we talk about the post-war situation and COVID-19 affecting in the field, we should say that in both crisis situations, the civil society organizations basically took the lead in fighting against and resisting the hardship of the country. So we can conclude that the civil society organizations have more willingness, more motivation, as well as more capacity to handle the crisis situation. And this was the case also in the first war in Nagorno-Karabakh, after the earthquake in 1988, or after the closure of the borders, etc., etc. So this shows that the civil society organizations have truly more capacity in working in the field. However, we should say that the COVID-19 pandemic and the 44-day war shook the basis of the democracy in Armenia. So, and a new narrative is in the ground that is really against the democratization, which is the narrative that the democracy confronts the national security. So this is a very, very strong narrative that is backed with very bad arguments, but because of the manipulation, the people started believing. Because the main argument made by the people who stand for this narrative is that before that we had authoritarian country, but we had better security. Currently we have somehow democratic country, but we have issues in the national security. So, and this should be the first thing that the civil society organizations should act against, because this is very dangerous for the society itself, because this is very, very dangerous, because it's harder to act against narrative than to create a new narrative. So creating positive narratives should be one of the things that the NGOs and the civil society organizations should take the lead in the upcoming months or maybe the years. And also, by talking about the pandemic and about the post-war situation, we should say that there is another very dangerous narrative, which is that the CSO sector brought the current authorities into the power, and now somehow they have to bear the burden of the loss in the war, which is not acceptable. And also the society should understand that the idea of the revolution, change of the power, was supported by the CSO. It does not necessarily mean that the CSOs are supporting the current government fully, and even vice versa. The CSOs oppose the current government harshly in many issues, as the lack of the reform in the field of justice, especially in the field of transitional justice, and also not having an assessment on the past, because this should have been the starting point for the new government. And in both cases, we see a total failure. So, when talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, we can say that CSOs were, and especially the ones working in the field of freedom of speech or in the field of media, they had a lot of issues, because the government firstly tried to impose restrictions, and what we see, it was prohibited basically for any journalist to report anything aside from the official sources. So, firstly imposing these measures, the government saw that this is inefficient, and they abandoned all the limitations completely. So once we had nothing, and then we had a huge gap, which was later on filled with all manipulation, starting from the COVID-19 to be as a chemical or weapon against the society, to the 5G concept. So, we see that the restrictions were inappropriate, and this gave a birth to more manipulations than if we had better solutions from the very beginning. So, as to talk about the recommendations and about the outlook to the future we should conclude that the civil society should continue its role as a watchdog for the government and for the authorities, and also the civil society organization should continue working, especially in the field of human rights and in the field of democratization, to break the current narrative of democratization being against the national security. So this is the main work that the civil society should somehow complete in the upcoming years. But at the same time, the civil society should be really very proud because once again they prove themselves to be more efficient in the crisis situations, and maybe if we want a better and more transparent governance, the current authorities or the ones that would come later should create really efficient links for the cooperation between the civil society organizations and the government, because the ones that exist on the paper do not work or are not enough as a leverage for the civil society organizations to act as watchdogs for the current authorities. And we can conclude that even if the post-revolutionary authorities wanted to include the civil society organizations in the policy-making process, however, we can say that it was on the paper only, and the recommendations by the civil society organizations were not included in the policy documents later on.